What's going on, you guys? My name's Ty Knots and welcome to Top 5 Unknowns. 5 scary stories that shouldn't be told in the dark. Number 5. Have you ever felt as though someone was watching you through a bedroom window? Perhaps you've worried that if you open the window late at night, something ghoulish will stare back at you. This story, titled The Window, was posted on Reddit by user Earthling Ralph. The short scary story describes a character named Ben who spent several sleepless nights paranoid about his bedroom window. Ben inspected the window during the daytime hours and found that no trees, bushes, or animals were the cause of the mysterious noise. Here's the story of Ben and his window. It started maybe a week ago, and it kept Ben up every night since it began. A tapping on the window of his bedroom in the middle of the night. It terrified him since the first incident. Quiet at first, but louder as the nights went on. He would turn his head away from the window towards the open bedroom door in hopes that it might make it go away. He would pretend to ignore the constant quiet tapping. He'd pretend to sleep and never dared look at what was actually tapping. There were no trees outside his window, and his bedroom was on the second floor of the house. He didn't know what to tell his parents. He didn't know what could be tapping on his window. On the third night of the tapping, Ben heard a voice whisper outside the window. He didn't want to believe it, but heard the phrase, "Let us in." It was muffled, and it came from the other side of the window. He taped a piece of paper to the window, so he couldn't see through it anymore, and he always kept his window closed and locked from then on. He wondered how his parents couldn't hear the nightly incessant tapping. It was beginning to get louder, and it felt more demanding. Night after night, he would leave his TV on, or sleep with headphones on, but somehow he could still feel that there was something out there, tapping and waiting. After a few more nights of sleeplessness, he finally decided to purchase some over-the-counter sleeping pills. He kept his door wide open as usual, but the light of the hallway helped him feel safer. He took the medicine and slept a deep, much-needed sleep. He snored loudly that night after his first rest in days, and the noise woke his mother. She walked by his open door on her way to grab a glass of water after being awoken. She noticed it was so hot in his room and smelled like a teenager's bedroom that had no fresh air in a week. She quietly wandered by him and decided to open his window for him. She unlocked it and opened it as wide as it could go. She took a breath of cool, fresh air and then turned around to make her way out of his room. On her way towards the door, she heard a low, deep voice behind her. It was quiet but very clear because there was no window in the way anymore. The voice stated, "Thank you." Number 4. This Reddit story was posted by the user Loco Hong. The title accurately describes the plot of this story, called My Story About My Television and the Long Neck Woman. The unsettling story follows a terrifying experience that a young girl had while staying home alone one night. The best part of the story is how descriptive it is, so the reader can easily establish a visual of the mysteries happening. I'm 17 and live in Macau. This story was based on what happened to me about 3 months ago. I only recently found this community and decided to post what happened to me to share my experience. I was home alone on a Thursday night, using my phone in the living room, browsing through social media and looking at memes. My parents were both out working late and had messaged me telling me to settle my own dinner. My older sister was out with her friends and would be back just as late, or maybe even later than my parents. Naturally, I had the TV turned on as background noise because honestly, yes, I was scared of being home alone, and some background noise made me feel more comfortable. The TV was cranked up to half volume on a news channel, but suddenly it crackled for no reason. I looked up, feeling a bit weirded out, but didn't exactly freak out or anything because the TV was admittedly pretty old. I don't come from a well-to-do family, and we had this same TV since I was 9 or 10. I probably should have turned the TV off then if I knew what was going to happen next. Around 10 or 15 minutes later, this awful screaming began. It was high-pitched and sounded like something out of a horror movie. It wasn't choppy screaming, but one long, uninterrupted scream. This definitely triggered my fight or flight instincts. My first thought was the neighbors. Maybe it was child abuse or something. But then I realized the sound was much closer. I thought maybe it was from my phone. Maybe I'd accidentally played a video or a soundtrack or something. The screaming was extremely human-like, and it was very frightening to hear, especially alone. I put my phone to my ear to check if it was coming from there. As I held my phone to my ear, my eyes drifted to the TV, and there it was, a lady's face with an impossibly stretched jaw. Her skin was clammy and the color of clay, and her eyes were rolled up so that I could only see the whites of them. Her mouth had extended to her upper chest area, which looked really grotesque and terrifying. Her hair was black and long, frazzled and all over the place. Her cheekbones were high and startlingly obvious, but with the most prominent feature about her being her neck. It actually resembled a noodle. It was long and thin, unbelievably thin. You had to be there to actually understand how impossibly thin it was, and it just shot straight up, connecting her head to her body, and it's surprising to me that her neck didn't snap from the weight. Her teeth were yellowish or greenish, I can't really remember, but they were misshapen and revolting. She was wearing a dark pink outfit, I think, but I remember it being savagely torn so her breasts were partly exposed. The screaming was coming from her, and it was loud and high-pitched, piercing to the ear, and I really regretted putting the TV on half volume. Obviously, I screamed back, but looking back, I was just repeatedly swearing in my head. What on earth was I supposed to do? I lunged for the TV remote and jammed the off button. Surprise, it didn't work, so I threw my phone at the TV. Yes, I know it was stupid, and yes, I was a moron. In my defense though, the screaming was really throwing me off and disorienting me. That was the second mistake I made that I would regret later on. The phone smacked the TV and fell to the floor, and maybe I was imagining it, but the woman seemed to scream even louder now. I ran into my room and slammed the door, breathing heavily. My heart was pounding, and my head was throbbing, and my hands were shaking. I actually didn't know what to do. I contemplated just going to sleep, but the screaming was still on, and I seriously feared for my parents' and sister's lives because this was definitely supernatural. The image of that strange woman was seared into my memory, and I couldn't get it out of my head. The scream was continuous, and she didn't even stop for a breath. After a while, I just broke down sobbing in my room. The screaming resonated through my house. I know it was stupid of me to throw my phone and leave it in the living room, but it was the only thing I had close to me, and I instinctively just threw it. I certainly could have used it right there and then to contact the police or something, as it was close to 1 a.m., and I was wondering why my neighbors weren't even coming over to check on me. Moments passed, and dare I say an hour, and I was sitting in my bed shivering at the horrific scream that was echoing through my house. I'd like to take this moment to clarify that I did not have a computer or a laptop in my room, and my parents were strict Christians and believed that the internet was the devil, so they were really strict on my internet usage. Basically, I was cut off from all contact to the outside world unless I stepped outside my room, and honestly, I just didn't have the nerve to. Imagine my fear when a few moments later, the screams changed to manic laughter. The screams slowly transitioned to eerie giggling and then to psychotic laughter. It was then that I felt as though someone had wrapped their spiny fingers around my throat when I heard it. I yelped and grabbed my neck, panting furiously like a dog, my eyes darting behind me and around the room for an invisible entity, but there was nothing there. Looking back, that part was probably my mind playing tricks on me. The laughter continued, and I started screaming vulgarities at it, which probably wasn't the wisest thing to do, and began crying like a baby afterwards, because really, what else was I going to do? The laughter abruptly stopped, and I actually swear my heart stopped when I heard a thud outside in the living room, accompanied by the sound of glass shattering. My mind was screaming at me that she had just jumped out of the TV. I was actually shaking, and tears were flowing down my face, and I started to hiccup. I shook my head really violently, just chanting, "No, no, 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 no." I'm not going to lie, suicide did cross my mind. Then I heard singing. It was an eerie tune, one I'd never heard before, and I can't exactly remember the lyrics, so I'll replace the words I didn't catch with something. I know it kinda ruins the story, but I was crying and my heart was hammering loudly, and the woman wasn't exactly belting out the lyrics. Believe me, I want to know the words as badly as you do, but it went something like roses and pin drops, bleeding on something, ghastly and grisly, something the devil, I'll be something 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 funeral. He's coming, he's coming. It was a sing-song voice, teasing and somewhat hypnotic, but I'll never forget how I felt when she knocked on my door. It was a sweet and gentle knock at first. I was whimpering on my bed, blanket pulled up to my knees, and she began hammering loudly at the door, screaming, "Let me in." Gone was her sweet and angelic, eerie voice. It was low and gruff, demonic and threatening now, and sounded very similar to the demon from that movie, The Exorcist. I screamed and cried, and I could hear the pulsing of blood to my head and my neck, pumping loudly over the hammering of something outside. My ears were blocked for some reason, and my throat was so dry and sore from crying. Mucus ran from my nose, and my chest ached. I clawed at myself, shaking uncontrollably and violently. Then I heard the keys to the front door. It was my parents, I thought, gasping, and they were back. At this point, I'd actually accepted death, but no way would I let my parents die as well. I sprang out of bed and burst out of my room. She was no longer outside my door, and to my surprise, I ran to the front door just past the living room, stepping on shards of broken glass and cutting my feet on them. The pain shot up my leg, but I just kept running, screaming, "Run, run." My parents caught me at the front door, and I was not a pretty sight. I must have looked like a raving lunatic, cheeks puffed out from crying and red-faced from sobbing, screaming, "Run, please run." My mother just stepped forward and hugged me. I pushed her back and tried to violently force both of them out, screaming the word "run" again. My father began screaming, "What's going on with you?" But all I could say was "woman, thin neck woman, go." Well, my parents didn't listen to me. They just entered the house, especially my father. That's just the way he is. I'm sure my mother would have heeded my warning and ran, and I wish they both would have run, because I wouldn't have looked like such a fool in front of them. In the living room, the TV was smashed and glass shards were strewn all over the floor. There was my blood on the glass shards, and my dad freaked out, thinking I'd cut myself purposefully. My mother sat me down and told me to tell them what happened, and I babbled the entire story. They could barely hear me over the sobbing, and I had to repeat the story twice for them to understand me. My father checked the entire house, but there was no woman there. So what could it have been? I could see in their eyes that they didn't believe my story even a little bit. They told me that they would talk to me the next morning, but I couldn't sleep. I didn't sleep, and I stayed up all night. The memory of those song lyrics and its tune played over and over in my head. Nevertheless, I'm grateful my parents took me seriously enough to the extent of calling the police and reporting a home invasion. I remember overhearing police reports of how unusual and unsettling it was that the TV was smashed from the inside, not the outside, as if it had exploded. They took my statement, but I saw it all in their eyes. The same look as my parents. They didn't believe me. They labeled me as a teenager with depression and that I had hallucinated and inflicted self-bodily harm, judging by the claw marks on my thighs. I now have to see a therapist to regularly cope with this supposed depression. I told the therapist this story, but as usual, she revealed that she too didn't believe a word that I said. The only one who actually somewhat believes me is my sister. She knows I don't have depression, and she knows I'm not stupid enough to lie about something like this. She convinced my parents to move houses, using my mental health as an excuse, saying that being in that house where I had hallucinations might trigger my depression further. I'm so grateful to her for doing that. Now I'm in my new house after I moved, and I have a slight phobia of TVs, but I'm doing well. I take medication regularly, and I've never seen the long neck woman again. Not that I want to. Number 3. Reddit user KikiTo shared this dark tale. The story is accurately titled, "She Was Eating Her Own Flesh." A young man visits an abandoned home as part of a welfare check, and what happens to him when he arrives will keep you up at night. Early last week, I was called out to conduct a welfare check at an abandoned house as a report came in, stating that there was something seemingly strange emitting from a vacant house at the end of a usually quiet cul-de-sac. Over the radio, I was also informed that the caller sounded like a young female, and that he hesitated when giving precise details before hanging up abruptly. From the exasperated tone of the dispatcher when relaying the information, I could tell we were in universal agreement that it was probably a prank call. Generally speaking, when a vague or outlandish description of a situation like this comes from someone who sounds like they're in their teens, it often turns out to be a joke. Of course, we still have to respond regardless, so I gave a short acknowledgement and reassurance that I was on my way to the location, and then allowed my mind to wander. As I was already considering whether I should simply scold the pranksters or scare them into realizing they'd done wrong, any thought of it being a true emergency had already left me. However, when I rolled up to the house, I had my doubts. The street was quiet, and there were no not-so-subtly parked cars with people peeping out of them as if it were to be a prank. This in itself wasn't unusual, as it was an ungodly hour of the morning on a weekday, and most people should be asleep, and that's exactly what it looked like. From within my car, I radioed back to confirm that I had just arrived, and then took a moment longer to scan the area for any potential dangers before cautiously stepping out into the street. It was at this point that I started to get a little nervous. There was a storm coming, which meant that it was a dark night, and even though it hadn't started raining just yet, the developing clouds blocked out the stars and moon, making the area substantially more shrouded in darkness. In addition to this, the accompanying breeze was just enough to push leaves across the asphalt, creating a sinister rustling sound that whittled my bravery down to a thin twig. While I waited, I decided to inspect the address to which I'd been called. It was definitely an abandoned house, and windows were covered with newspaper, aged junk mail hung out of the letterbox, and the garden was in serious need of a manicure. From what I could tell though, there wasn't any sound at all coming from the building, let alone an unusual noise. The only thing that was even slightly amiss for the house was that the front door appeared to be just barely cracked open. Most people tend to lock a house before they leave it for good. When the second cruiser pulled up, I felt notably relieved, and after briefing him on the situation, we proceeded to conduct the check. Approaching the door, we banged on it and announced ourselves. The other officer and I exchanged glances, and we were silently agreeing with each other that this wasn't normal, and that we should be ready for anything. We proceeded with caution, repeating our announcement as we pushed the door open the remaining way and entered the residence. Much like everything else, it was dark inside, and we required flashlights to see. Sweeping the rooms in a standard two-man formation, we moved carefully and methodically. The interior was far worse than the outside had fooled us into believing, and it seemed the house had been abandoned for much longer than we thought. All the interior doors were missing or broken, light fittings stripped, and trash littered every room, with an assortment of dead insects and animal bones mixed in for good measure. Walls had been tagged with the usual graffiti one would expect in an abandoned place, and water-damaged trails ran the wallpaper predominantly in each corner of the house. The kitchen was a decaying mess of cupboards, and the bathroom was undescribably soiled, possibly even been there for decades. For a time, we made our way through each room in the house, slowly, and were repeatedly greeted by disappointment as we continued to find nothing. However, as we approached what we assumed to be the master bedroom, a sense of unease began to build. We left that room in particular for last as it was the only one with an intact door, and it didn't take years of experience on the job to conclude that if there were anyone in this house, that's where they'd be. We were, by this point, hoping it was just some stupid teenagers trying to scare a couple of cops, but I think part of me knew it likely wasn't. As we neared the door, we began to hear a soft ripping sound. It wasn't exactly like fabric tearing, it was more wet sounding than that, but pretty close to it. The sound was accompanied by what could only be described as a wet chewing, similar to what you might hear if someone was slurping noodles and then chewing with their mouth open. My mind was racing to rationalize it, and I settled on the idea that perhaps there was an animal, maybe a dog, chewing on the carcass of another animal. The reality of the situation was unfortunately far worse. When we reached the door, we announced ourselves once again, shouting, "We're the police and we're coming in," loud enough for anyone to think that it was a whole SWAT team standing there, and then pushed the door open in a polite but urgent manner. That's when we saw her. She was a disheveled-looking woman sitting in the center of a room with candles flickering excitedly beside her. There were strange symbols drawn in what appeared to be her own blood all across the walls. She turned to us with a curious expression, a piece of flesh hanging out of her mouth, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It was then that I realized she didn't have any lips. It would seem that she'd chewed them off herself, so that when she smiled it was as a grimace between her cheeks and eyes. Our shocked expressions must have been amusing to her, because she began to laugh, cackling maniacally to herself. Frozen by the utter insanity and shock of the situation, there was nothing we could do except stare in morbid horror. She was just sitting there, smiling like a lunatic, giggling maniacally and carving off her own skin with a paring knife, piece by piece without care. Then taking the flesh into her mouth and chewing it with an unadulterated relish as we watched, still too stunted to move. I'd seen crazy people do insane things before, but this was unreal. The memory of it now is etched into my mind so strongly that sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see it. I never did find out exactly what was wrong with her. Once we hand over people to a medical care facility, we rarely hear anything back. However, I suspect that some very strong drugs may have been involved. We also never managed to locate the original caller. No one came forward when we appealed, and I just hope that they weren't in that house. Number 2. This story is actually quite popular on the subreddit No Sleep. The story's been shared and discussed for a few years now. It's a believable tale of a young man being haunted by the ghost of his deceased girlfriend via text and social media. In the original Reddit thread, an organized timeline is provided to the reader. Screenshots and other proof are also included in the lengthy post. Tonight's kind of a catalyst for this post. I just received another message, and it's worse than any of the others. My girlfriend died on the 7th of August, 2012. She was involved in a 3-car collision driving home from work when someone ran a red light. She passed away within minutes on the scene. We'd been dating for 5 years at that point. She wasn't big on the idea of marriage, but if she had been, I would have married her within 3 months of our relationship. She was vibrant, the kind of girl that she was dare every time. She was happiest when camping, but a total technophile too. She always smelled like cinnamon. That being said, she wasn't perfect. She always said something along the lines of, "If I die first, don't only say good things about me. I've never liked that. If you don't pay me out, you're doing me a disservice. I've got so many flaws and that's just part of me." So this is for her. The music she liked and the music she actually listened to were very different. Her idea of affection was a side hug. She had really long toes, kind of like a chimpanzee. But on to the meat of the story. M had been dead for approaching 13 months when she first messaged me. It was September 4th, 2013. This is when it began. I'd left Emily's Facebook account activated so I could send her the occasional message, post on her wall, and go through her albums. It felt too final to memorialize it. I share access with her mother, Susan, meaning her mother has her login and password and has spent a total of approximately 3 minutes on the website. After a little confusion, I assumed that this message must have come from her. November 16th, 2013. I received confirmation from Susan that she hadn't logged in to M's accounts since the week of her death. M knew a lot of people, so I instantly assumed this was one of her tech-savvy friends messing with me in the worst possible way. I noticed pretty much immediately that whoever was chatting with me was recycling old messages from our chat history. The wheels on the bus comment was coming from when we were discussing songs to play on a road trip that never eventuated. The hello messages had happened a million times before. Around February of 2014, Emily started tagging herself in my photos. I would get notifications for them, but the tag would generally always be removed by the time I got to it. The first time I actually caught one, it felt like someone had punched me in the gut. She would tag herself in spaces where it was plausible for her to be, or where she would usually be hanging out. I've got screenshots of 2 of them, and around this period I stopped being able to sleep. I was just too angry. She would tag herself in random photos every couple of weeks. The friends that noticed said something about how messed up it was. I found out recently that there have been friends who've noticed and didn't say anything, and some of them have removed me from their Facebook friends list because of it. At this point, some of you may be wondering why I didn't just kill my Facebook profile, and I wish I had. I did for a little while. On days when I can't get out there though, it's nice having my friends available to chat. It's nice visiting M's page when the little green circle isn't next to her name. I was already socially reclusive when M was alive. Her death turned me into something pretty close to a hermit, and Facebook and MMOs are really my only social outlets. March 15th, I sent what I assumed was M's hacker a message. On March 25th, I received an answer. It wasn't until going over these logs a few months later that I noticed she was recycling my own words as well. My response seems kind of lackluster here. I was intentionally providing he or her with emotional bait to keep them interested in their game. I was working off the assumption that this type of person would be the kind of person that would thrive on the distress of others. I was posting in tech forums looking for ways to track this person and even contacting Facebook. I needed to keep them around so I could gather more evidence. But before anyone asked, yes, I changed the password and all the security info countless times. On the 16th of April, I received this. This seems like word salad, like all of our conversations so far have been recycled from previous messages that she sent. On the 29th of April, I hadn't discovered any leads. Facebook had told me the location that her page had been accessed from, but since her death, they're all places I can account for. My response here wasn't bait. Her response stating, "Yo, ask Nathan," was an in-joke too lame worth explaining, but seeing her say it again absolutely crippled me. My reaction in real life was much less pretty, and I'm not expecting my bond back. Her last few messages had started to scare me, but I wouldn't admit it at this point. On the 8th of May, I didn't really have words for this. Freezing is the first original words that she sent to me. This has given me nightmares and have only started to kick in recently. I kept dreaming that she was in an ice-cold car, frozen blue and gray, and I'm standing outside in the warmth screaming at her to open the door. She doesn't even realize that I'm there. Sometimes her legs are outside with me. 24th of May. I wasn't actually drunk. She wasn't an affectionate girl, but it always seemed embarrassed to exchange I love yous, cuddle, and talk about how much we meant to each other. She was more comfortable when it was all boozed up, and I got fake drunk a lot. Her reply is what prompted me to memorialize her page, thinking it might help curb this behavior. It might seem innocuous compared to her previous message. It's pasted from an old conversation where I was trying to convince her to let me drive her home from a friend's. In the collision, the dashboard had crushed her. She was severed in a diagonal line from her right hip to midway down her left thigh. One of her legs was found tucked under the back seat. Going back in time though, 7th of August 2012. There are logs from the day that she died. She was usually home from work by about 4:30. This, alongside with a couple of voicemails, is the last time I talked to her under the assumption that she was still alive. You'll see why I'm showing you these soon. Fast forward to yesterday, 1st of July 2014. I memorialized her page a couple days after I received the message about walking. Until today, she'd been quiet. She wasn't even tagging herself in my photos. I don't know what to do anymore. Do I kill her memorial page? But what if it is her? I want to puke and I don't know why this is happening. I just heard a Facebook alert again and I'm too afraid to swap windows to check it. Number 1. This post was created by First Breath 1, a Reddit user who describes a haunting situation in which the main character accepted an anonymous spam call. The character was unaware of truly how horrifying the experience would be that would follow. "Hello, is this Mr. Henderson?" There was no real reason for me to pick up the phone. The spam app on my cell called out a mysterious number right away, but I decided to take it anyway. There was no one else left in life for me to talk to, even a debt collector sounded good at the moment. My wife was murdered in 2015. There really isn't an easy way to say that other than getting it out of the way early. It was a random robbery gone wrong. One rainy night, some twisted person snuck into her house and shot her. The suspect was caught 2 days later and sentenced to life in prison, and he still sits there to this day. I've worked in web development ever since. The job is remote and the field caters to my hermit-like behavior out here in the woods in northern New Jersey. The lack of drug testing is really just an added benefit. I was perfectly free to do whatever I wanted in my life. I don't have any friends anymore, not really. Sometimes I guess it's easy to look for companionship in all the wrong places. Senior or junior, I replied to the lady, with a sigh before settling into the armchair in my office with a bottle of wine. It was rainy that night. The wind whipped old pine trees in our backyard so hard that I thought they might topple. Senior, she said, in a calm voice on the other line. She sounded familiar, but I blamed that notion on the half-empty bottle of wine. "Apologies, ma'am, but Senior died 6 years ago," I said, a little annoyed at the lack of record-keeping at this place. She paused. "Oh gosh, that's not what we have here. I'm so sorry, sir. We were not aware. Please forgive the intrusion and assumption. Would you mind holding on while I check my records?" A filing cabinet clicked steadily in her background as static crinkled. My guess was that the woman held the receiver to her shoulder. I chuckled a bit at the lack of audio quality. No, that's okay, no problem at all, no worries. Why don't you just start by telling me your name, I asked, cursing myself for the hint of shamelessness and the flirting at the end. She giggled. Something about that laugh was very familiar. "My name is Emily, and I work with this credit card company," she said in a rehearsed tone. Unfortunately, we cannot divulge which firm over the phone if you're not on the account, which you just admitted yourself, of course. Okay, I said. I'm guessing that you're Mr. Henderson's son, she mumbled, while audibly thumbing through papers. Yes, ma'am, that's right, but it's been years. I couldn't possibly be stuck with the old man's debt, right? She said, well, let's check, shall we? There was a panicked shuffling and opening of books in the background. I'm so sorry, sir, she replied in a regretful tone. The rules are in one of those 3-ring binders and they're very difficult to find. Please hold on for a moment. That's okay, I said. Did not know anybody still kept records that way. Do I get an email confirmation of this charge as well, I asked. She said, excuse me. And I said email, like electronic mail. A confirmation of the charge, I asked again, allowing my confusion to turn to frustration. We don't do that here, she said. Still a few years away from all those fancy features, she continued. But as you know, late payments are a pretty serious issue. They can even affect the credit score of an individual when a large amount has not been paid. Okay, of course, I said, genuinely starting to grow worried and a bit flustered. What can I do? Is there a Mrs. Henderson in the house? She asked quietly. Mrs. Henderson died in 2006, I said. What year did you say? She asked. That's so horrible. I really am batting 1,000 today. I gasped and that was it, that phrase. I don't know if it was the way she said it or the fact that simply not many people use that exact language, but as soon as she said it, something clicked in my memory. My wife worked for a credit card company before we met. Her name was also Emily, and her voice sounded like hers, but younger, more hopeful than I remembered. What's your last name? I asked. The line was silent. Look, I know it's a weird question, but please, I think we know each other enough now. I can't give that information out, she said. Okay, I said. Did you go to Jefferson Memorial High School? Yes, she replied. How did you know that? It was impossible. Emily was dead. The voice on the phone barely even sounded like her. It was younger, happier, more optimistic. This type of dream was actually the type of thing that kept me up a million sleepless nights in the past, and yet I was fully awake. Could it be a coincidence? I asked, is your mother's name Eva? There was silence on the other end of the line, and she responded, who is this? I took a deep breath. Either I understood what was happening or I had just lost my mind, but I might as well enjoy the ride. The next question is going to sound strange, but what is today's date? I asked. She said, I'm sorry, sir, what? One moment. She paused and shuffled around some more. Today's date is July 9th, 1999. It was impossible. Could it be the storm, or possibly the anniversary of her death? I said, Emily, listen to me. She said, okay, sir, this conversation is getting a little strange. Let's keep it to the payment plan. I said, listen to me carefully. One day you're going to meet a man. You're going to really love him. You'll love him more than you could ever know. I had to give her something to remember. I said, on your first holiday together, he'll buy you one gift for all 12 days of Christmas. That sounds dreamy, she replied, and said, are you one of those psychics? I said, I'm serious. You'll marry this man, Emily. He'll buy you the ring you always wanted. The ceremony will be beautiful in your own hometown. Your entire family will be there, including Aunt Zelda and your grandma from Tennessee. She said, I like this fortune cookie, with her statement dripping with sarcasm. But 2 years later, on July 9th, 2015, you'll be murdered in the home that you shared together. Her tone shifted slightly. She said, so what do I do? First, I tried to tell her to avoid the house that day, to never date me, to stay away forever, and to find a better life somewhere else. But somewhere in the middle of my rant, the line disconnected to the tune of a blood-curdling scream. I called back to find a non-working number, and she never answered again. I fell asleep listening to the thunder roll through the sky. The scream from that night repeated from time to time, with flashes of her body on the floor occasionally invading my mind. I never questioned the call. I never asked why. Maybe it was God and maybe it was just time. But yesterday morning when I woke up, Emily was still by my side. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep updated with our videos.